Trump halts his Cadillac One motorcade for a homeless, elderly woman, and what he does next will leave millions inspired. That afternoon, the city was bathed in the relentless heat of the summer sun. The constant honking of car horns and the bustling crowds moving along the sidewalks painted a typical picture of a modern metropolis in full swing. Amid this rush of energy, Donald Trump's Cadillac One motorcade made its way through the city, exuding an air of authority. The lead car, polished to a gleaming shine, stood out brilliantly in the blazing sunlight, commanding the attention of anyone nearby. Inside the vehicle, Trump was intently focused on a report being presented to him by one of his advisors. The assistant's steady voice filled the car's interior, offering updates that demanded attention. Yet, Trump's mind began to wander, his attention pulled toward something outside. His eyes locked onto a scene that made him pause. There, amid the rush of pedestrians on the crowded sidewalk, stood a frail, elderly woman. She was so small and delicate that it seemed as though the throngs of people were swallowing her whole. Her hair was stark white, and the lines of age and struggle were carved deeply into her weathered face. In her trembling hands, she clutched a worn-out cardboard sign with faded but clear words, "Please help me. My granddaughter needs a miracle." Her eyes were filled with a silent plea, as though she was waiting for anyone, to take notice. But the people around her merely passed by, some throwing her a brief glance, others turning their faces away. No one stopped. Trump sat frozen for a moment, his gaze unwavering as he watched the elderly woman. Something stirred deep within him, an urge he couldn't ignore, a feeling that he simply couldn't move on without doing something. "Stop the car," he commanded, his voice steady, yet full of authority. Without hesitation, the motorcade screeched to a halt right in the middle of the busy street. The sound of the brakes was sharp, and vehicles behind them came to a sudden, abrupt stop, creating a ripple of confusion and surprise. Inside the car, Trump's advisors and security personnel exchanged uncertain glances. "Sir, this area is not safe. We should keep moving," one of the security officers advised, his tone full of concern. Trump, however, shook his head. His eyes remained fixed on the woman standing on the sidewalk, and there was no wavering in his resolve.
"No."
"I want to know her story," he said firmly. The heavy silence that followed spoke volumes, but no one dared to argue. Trump opened the car door and stepped out. As soon as his polished shoes hit the pavement, the world seemed to shift. The usual noise of the city softened, and all eyes turned toward him. Some recognized him instantly, pulling out their phones to capture the unexpected moment unfolding before them. Trump made his way toward the elderly woman with deliberate, measured steps. His presence was undeniable, but when he reached her, he didn't act as the powerful leader everyone saw him as. Instead, he knelt down and looked into her eyes, not with the weight of authority, but with the genuine compassion of a man moved by her story. "What's your name?" Trump asked, his voice softer than usual, but still carrying the weight of his stature. The elderly woman looked up at him, her eyes clouded with uncertainty and fear, but also hope. After a long pause, her voice trembled as she replied, "My name is Martha." "Why are you here?" Trump asked gently, his tone calm, offering her reassurance in a moment that must have felt both overwhelming and fragile. Martha took a deep breath, clutching the cardboard sign, as if letting go of it would mean losing her last shred of hope. "My granddaughter, she needs help. Her parents, they died in the flood recently. It's just me now, and I don't know what to do. We've lost everything, our home, everything we had. I just want to save her." Martha's voice cracked with emotion, her words carrying the raw pain and helplessness of a woman who had lost it all. Trump listened intently, his heart heavy with empathy. Her words didn't just fill his ears, they resonated deeply within him. He could hear her despair, but he could also hear her determination, the will to fight for her granddaughter. Without a word, he straightened up, his gaze shifting back toward the motorcade. "Get the car ready. I want to go where she's staying," he said, his voice resolute. One of the security officers stepped forward, his voice filled with concern. "Sir, This area is dangerous. We shouldn't linger here. Trump turned to him, his gaze unwavering. If she can live there, so can I, he said, his tone firm and unyielding. Visit if you're scared. Feel free to stay behind, Martha said quietly. But no one spoke up. Not a single protest disturbed the stillness that hung in the air. Trump placed a steady, reassuring hand on Martha's frail shoulder, his eyes now filled with determination. Lead the way. I want to meet your granddaughter. Martha looked up at him, her eyes brimming with a newfound flicker of hope, a spark she hadn't felt in a long time. She nodded slowly, her steps hesitant at first, but then more resolute as she began to guide Trump and his motorcade down a path none of them had expected to take, a journey that would change everything. Martha moved at a slow, deliberate pace. Her frail body seemed to buckle beneath the weight of the memories she carried and the responsibilities she bore. In her hands, she clutched the tattered sign with a vice-like grip, as though it was the last tangible thing connecting her to the life she once knew. Behind her, the motorcade of Cadillac One crawled along the street, creating a surreal contrast against the vibrant backdrop of the bustling neighborhood. Trump walked beside her, his eyes fixed on her small, stooped figure. He could feel the weight she carried in every labored step she took. "Mrs. Martha, what happened to your families?" Trump asked, his voice breaking the silence that had enveloped them. His tone was warm but serious, with an undeniable undertone of concern. Martha paused for a moment, her face turning towards him. Her cloudy eyes reflected not only sorrow, but also a glimmer of resilience. "It was the biggest flood I've ever seen," she said, her voice quivering with emotion. "The water rose so fast, faster than we could do anything. My son, Jack, and my daughter-in-law, Laura, tried to get Emma to safety, but they didn't make it." She took a shaky breath, her hands clutching the sign tighter, as though it could somehow suppress the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Jack yelled at me to take Emma and run," she continued, her voice breaking. "He and Laura said they'd figure out a way to escape later, but the current was too strong. It swept them away. I couldn't do anything except hold Emma tight and pray." Her voice cracked as she remembered that moment, the moment she realized she had lost everything. "When I found my son, it was too late," she said, tears welling up in her eyes and rolling down her weathered face. "We lost everything. Our home, our belongings, our memories. Now it's just me and Emma, trying to survive each day. But I'm old, and I can't give her the life she deserves." Trump stood silently for a moment, letting her words sink in. Her story wasn't just one of personal tragedy, it was a painful reflection of countless families enduring loss, despair, and hardship. "What have you been doing since then?" Trump asked softly, his voice now low and full of understanding. Martha lowered her head, her shoulders slumped even further. "I've done whatever I could, from cleaning houses to collecting recyclables. But I'm not as strong as I used to be. No one wants to hire me anymore," she said, the weight of her struggle evident in her voice. "In the end, I took to the streets, holding the sign, hoping someone would stop to help. But they just passed by, as if I don't exist." Trump didn't say anything in response, but his gaze grew heavier. He watched her as she continued on, her steps growing slower now, each one weighed down not only by her physical exhaustion, but by the sorrow of her past. They turned into a narrow alley, the surroundings becoming increasingly grim. The walls on either side were worn and cracked, with broken bricks scattered on the ground. The motorcade behind them was almost lost in the suffocating atmosphere, the stench of garbage permeating the air. "We're here," Martha said quietly, pointing to the end of the alley. Before them stood a makeshift shelter, cobbled together from plastic sheets, wooden scraps, and whatever other materials could be found. The torn tarps revealed a cramped space inside, barely big enough for two people to lie down. An old wooden bed, a few broken plastic chairs, and a table fashioned from stacked cardboard boxes were the sum of their possessions. Trump stopped in front of the shelter, his eyes scanning the surroundings. A few children, their faces full of curiosity and caution, peeked out from behind the shelter. The scene was heartbreaking in its simplicity, and it struck Trump deeply. This was the reality Martha and Emma lived in, day after day. Children streaked with dirt played with empty tin cans, their eyes stealing curious glances at Trump and the motorcade. The adults stood back, their eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and unease, unsure of what to make of the unusual sight before them. From within the shelter, a small voice called out. Grandma, a frail little girl, no older than 10, stepped out from the shadows. Her hair, tangled and unkempt, nearly obscured her face, and in her tiny hands, she held a makeshift doll made from a plastic bottle and scraps of fabric. Emma, come here, Mrs. Martha called gently. The girl hesitated for a moment before running to her grandmother, wrapping her small arms tightly around her. Her eyes, filled with both wonder and caution, shifted to Trump, who stood nearby. You don't have to be afraid, Emma, Trump said gently, crouching down to meet her eye level. Your name is Emma, right? The girl nodded, her gaze still wary, but the tension in her expression eased just a little. Can you tell me about yourself? Trump asked, offering a warm smile to soften her apprehension. Emma glanced toward Mrs. Martha, seeking her approval. When her grandmother nodded, the little girl took a deep breath and began speaking in a shaky voice. I don't remember much about that night, just that the water came so fast. My mom and dad told me to run to the neighbors, but they didn't make it. She paused, her voice trembling. After that, I stayed with Grandma, but she's worked so hard. I don't want her to suffer anymore. I just want her to rest. Her voice cracked as the tears began to stream down her thin cheeks. Trump placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice firm yet comforting. You've been very brave, Emma, and so has your grandmother. But from now on, you won't have to face this alone. I'm here to help. Emma looked up at him, her large, tear-filled eyes shining with gratitude. She nodded, but still clung tightly to Mrs. Martha, as if fearing this moment of kindness might slip away like a dream. Trump turned to his motorcade, his expression resolute. I want a full report on Mrs. Martha's health and living conditions here immediately, he commanded. Starting tonight, I want a medical team assessing both her and Emma. And not just them. I want to know about every family in this area. One of his advisors hesitated, speaking up softly. Sir, perhaps we should leave this to charitable organizations for long-term management. Trump didn't hesitate for a second. His voice rang out with unwavering conviction.
No.
They've waited long enough. If a little girl like Emma can stand here and fight for her grandmother, we have no excuse to delay action. It starts now. Emma's tear-filled eyes widened with gratitude, her voice small but full of emotion. Thank you, Mr. Trump. I just want Grandma to stop worrying. Trump bent down, meeting her gaze directly. I promise you, Emma, this is just the beginning. You've done enough. Now it's my turn to help. Emma and Mrs. Martha led Trump deeper into the slums, where sunlight struggled to penetrate the gloom. The rooftops were patchwork quilts of old tin sheets and plastic tarps, the narrow pathways growing tighter as they advanced, flanked by heaps of trash and stagnant puddles. The air was thick with the damp, moldy odor of decay. With every step Trump took, it became more apparent just how dire the circumstances were for the people living here. As they walked, residents began to emerge from their homes. Their eyes were filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. To them, the sight of someone like Trump, impeccably dressed in a suit, walking among the crumbling homes was something beyond their wildest imagination. At first, the onlookers kept their distance, observing from afar. Mrs. Martha glanced back at Trump, her voice soft but firm. Sir, I'm not the only one living like this. Many people here lost everything after the flood. We're not just poor. We're forgotten. Her words opened a floodgate, and the untold stories of others began to surface. A middle-aged man, thin and wearing a worn-out t-shirt, hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. His voice cracked with disbelief as he spoke. Mr. Trump, I can't believe you're really here. Trump nodded, his voice warm and encouraging. Can you share your story with me? The man took a deep breath, summoning what little courage he had left. My name's Sam. I used to work at a mechanic shop. After the flood, the shop was completely destroyed. I lost my job,